I want to welcome you to our event. It's called Choosing Healthy Landscapes Without Pesticides, Ethics and Lessons Learned from the Science and History of Toxic Regulation. So Prevent Cancer Now, that is the group that Meg basically runs. It's a national group that focuses on preventing cancer before it starts, with research, education, and advocacy for policy, regulatory, and legal changes. Prevent Cancer Now is a key source for scientific review and toxic issues among Canadian civil society organizations. And then the Council of Canadians. They're also been involved in helping with this event and with our initiative to try to get pesticide reduction in the area. And they're a leading social action organization that has chapters all across Canada. And they work to try to, they focus on clean water issues, fair trade, green energy, public health care, and having a vibrant democracy. They've done a lot of wonderful things. They've been involved in how we actually have the health system we currently have. So I just want to talk shortly. There's so many things that Meg's going to share with you today about concerns in Alberta in particular that people are unaware of. And I have lots of information here. One of the things being that we have tripled the use of one herbicide in Alberta in 15 years. And on agricultural land, we've at least doubled the intensity of pesticides. That doesn't include a number of pesticides in the class of insecticides called neonics, for short for neonicotinoids, which are implicated in bee deaths and insect losses around the globe. Really, really big concern, because if we lose insects, we won't have food to eat, basically. So this is something you can come and take a look at. I really recommend that you do, because for me, I have to see to believe things. I have to see the science and the evidence to believe that this is a concern. Otherwise, there's so many things going on in the world today, but this is really a big deal. So one of the other things that we've been working on is the fact that Edmonton is currently the only municipality in Canada and probably North America to use an insecticide called chlorpyrifos. Highly toxic and very harmful, and is considered ineffective by entomologists who have decided that they don't want to use it in their municipalities anymore. For mosquito larvae. Yes, thank you for saying that. Chlorpyrifos. It's the active ingredient in 30 different products. The one that we use here is called pyrate. P-Y-R-A-T-E. We've used Dursban in the past. Right now we're using pyrate. So Dr. Sears has pursued interests and research in environmental health for decades. She's wonderful. I hope that, I can't imagine if we didn't have her in Canada what we would do. As chair of Prevent Cancer Now, she works to provide improved scientific rigor and decision-making and assessment and regulation of toxicants and alternatives. At the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, Meg is pursuing the Canadian Environmental Health Information Infrastructure, a platform to facilitate research into environmental contributors to cancer and other conditions. The goal is to ultimately reduce disease with scientific evidence for effective actions. And I just recently looked to see that in Alberta, we have about 1/4 of Albertans suffering from at least one chronic health condition, and probably more than that, because the Canadian Association of Physicians, the Canadian Digestive Health Foundation on their webpage has stated that we've gone from 10 to 20 million Canadians diagnosed with at least one gut disease in 10 years. Now I think that probably has something to do with our food system. So that's about 2/3 of Canadians just with one chronic issue. That doesn't include a lot of other things that we're seeing dramatic increases in liver, kidney disease, and so many diseases. So Meg was trained in chemical engineering and applied chemistry, which I really suck at. I'm good at biology, but terrible at chemistry. University of Toronto, completed a doctorate in biochemical engineering at McGill University, and has a diverse laboratory experience, including energy research. With skills in scientific analysis and writing, she gained associations with research institutes at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, the Ottawa Hospital, and others. Some career highlights for Dr. Sears include writing the medical perspective on environmental sensitivities for the Canadian Human Rights Commission, leading to a policy under the Canadian Human Rights Act, conducting a scoping review on toxic elements, arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury, with Canadian Institutes for Health Research and Social Sciences, and Humanities Research Council funding, and numerous collaborations with members of environmental health committee of the Ontario College of Family Physicians, and prominent Canadian environmental health and legal groups. And while she's not working, you'll probably find Meg roving outdoors and playing in the mud. And I just want to introduce to you Dr. Sears from Prevent Cancer Now.
I understand it's supposed to use the microphone, so it does. Thank you ever so much for the very kind introduction. Actually, I'm delighted to be here. It's an honor because there's some very energetic and full-hearted people who've been working very hard for a long time for their communities. And so it's great to be able to lend a little bit of a scientific shoulder to the efforts. So I'm just going to, when I was preparing this, it felt as if I was making a salad. You know that horrible thing, you put in the lettuce and the peppers and, oh, but I have this too, and I'll add that because it's really important. And by the time you're finished, you have a huge salad bowl. But I understood that the purpose of today was really to give a broad overview to people who already know something about chemicals and health and so on, so that you can have a sense of what sorts of issues are out there, some of the arguments, and that you'll have an idea that there are routes to go down for further inquiries. And after this, if anybody wants to get hold of me, they can get hold of me through Cheryl or just Meg at preventcancernow.ca. It's a pretty easy email to remember. So really, there's two aspects to pesticides. There's the human health aspect and there's the environmental aspect. And if you think those aren't related, then perhaps you're in the wrong room. In any case, these are the only chemicals that we make to be toxic, and then we spread them in the environment to be toxic. Some are more targeted than others, but usually it's a very small fraction of this chemical that we put into the environment that actually reaches what it is that we want to kill. And the rest of it is affecting everything else. So what we do to our environment, we do to ourselves. This is Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson died of breast cancer. Silent Spring was talking about what was happening as a result of systemic pesticides, including DDT. DDT was a miracle that came out of the World War efforts. And when you're talking about figuring out what these chemicals are doing, there's a really big ethical concern that I have. So just within the last month, it was reported, there was a 50-year-long study, and they said, oh yeah, DDT definitely does contribute to breast cancer. If you've been exposed to DDT, you're more likely to get breast cancer. 50 years! So are we going to wait for a couple of generations before we take actions on pesticides? Just leaving that with you. Thank heavens it thinned eggshells. If it hadn't been for the birds that were dying off, who knows how long it would have taken to ban DDT. This is not a new issue. 1998, John Wargo wrote a very well-known book about the effects of pesticides on children. And pesticides, they're just organisms that are injurious, noxious, or troublesome. They're controlled by killing or repelling them. And they're regulated at the federal level, the provincial level. The federal level, they decide what is going to be permitted to be for sale across the country. The province can restrict that somewhat, and the province is responsible for enforcement and for allowing people licenses to apply these chemicals. And they're regulated at the federal level according to whether or not the risk of using this is acceptable. Health Canada doesn't say that any of these things are safe. The Act says, is the risk acceptable? That's kind of subjective. Just for our terminology, pesticides are that kill plants are called herbicides. The ones that kill insects are called insecticides. There's fungicides, there's rodenticides, and so on. So when some people use the word pesticides, you'll thought just a herbicide, but I just want us to be clear on that terminology. And so now moving on, I just want to illustrate briefly that Canadians really are getting sicker. Our kids need us to clean up our environment because the types of diseases that are increasing rapidly amongst Canadians, particularly younger Canadians, are not because of genetic drift, they are because of our environment. They're what they're called non-communicable diseases because they're not caused by germs, generally. So these are blood cancers, brain tumors, obesity-related cancers, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dementia. Everybody knows somebody with these conditions. So very quickly, we're just going to go through some of these slides. This is American data looking at non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is one of the most commonly, one of the conditions that's most commonly associated with pesticide exposures. It's been going up not only in the older populations, according to the yellow line at the top, it's been increasing in younger populations. And then just published fairly recently, if you put on your epidemiological microscope in the youngest populations, 15 to 19-year-olds, it's also been going up. So on the top, we've got both the acute lymphoblastic leukemia and the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and then underneath we have each of the individual ones. So these are definitely going up amongst the youngest populations. A study in Manitoba found that in children between 1984 and 2013, every single year in children and adolescents, that the incidence of leukemia and Hodgkin's lymphoma has been going up. And it's been clustered. Things are clustered because there's something in the environment that's higher in one place than in another that is contributing to these. They don't have enough information about what is in those locations to say what is contributing to this disease. But it's clustered and it's increasing. That's not good news. And this is from the Central Brain Tumor Registry in the States. The brain tumors are going up. And when you dig into the data, it's the most aggressive gliomas that are increasing. And these can be associated with radiofrequency radiation. They can also be, they've also been repeatedly associated with pesticide exposure. And Dr. Jay Esau, right here in Edmonton, has said that in Edmonton, in Calgary, in Alberta, he is seeing similar, very quick increases in these very aggressive tumors with poor prognosis.
And by age, what can
Oh,
we say?
it's 15 to 39 years of age, that's the whole group on the top left. And then the top right is 15 to 19 years, 20 to 24, 25 to 29, 30 to 34, and 34 to 35 to 39. Yes.
Are there equal information about the older age group?
The same group has similar reports on older people. The incidence is already a lot higher in older people. This is a malignancy that increases with age.
Right.
But this is the most extraordinary finding, that in the youngest where we don't, and what's really amazing is that it used to be across the board that leukemia and lymphomas, that these blood cancers were more prevalent, that the incidence was higher for those than for the brain tumors. But in the youngest group reported here, the 15 to 19-year-olds, it's actually the brain tumors that are more frequent now. So that's a big shift in the landscape of cancers in this age group. Colorectal cancer is going up in younger Canadians as well. Again, this is a cancer that people say, oh, well, you get that because you're getting older. Well, no, in fact, it's been going up 6.7% every year in those 15 to 29 years old. Yes?
Just wondering, is there particular areas or in Canada, or is it localized? Is that kind of maybe making the whole data a lot worse because of a few select areas, or is that in correlation?
It's not smooth all the way across Canada, but it's happening in every province. So it's, you know, if you actually, it used to be that Public Health Agency of Canada would publish much more finely grained data, whereas Canadian Cancer Society and StatsCan now only produce data at a provincial level. So that's one thing that I've been asking Public Health Agency of Canada to do, to start reporting the same way as they did at the beginning of this century, to do it in a much more fine-grained methods, so that it's possible to see these clusters. Yes, sure.
Are you going to talk about how irritable bowel disease
Yeah.
can lead to
Yes.
this? Okay.
And this is happening. People say, you know, the public health message is, well, eat your fruits and vegetables and exercise more and you won't get this cancer. But the report that came out in 2017 is that Canadians are eating more fruits and vegetables. These people are exercising more, and this is happening despite following the general public health advice. So the public health advice is missing out on something. So again, we're seeing that cancers are being associated with obesity. Now, my position is that obesity is not the end result. It's a manifestation of chemical exposures to a wide range of chemicals that affect metabolism and the perception of being full, having a perception of hunger. It's quite a complicated system, but we know that certain drugs will make you gain a lot of weight. The people go off of meds for depression and so on because they test the weight gain. If you look in a leukemia treatment facility, people have to take very high doses of prednisone. Their entire body shape changes. So we know that chemicals will make you gain weight. And some of these same chemicals are known to be carcinogens. So there's a big overlap. And so this focus on obesity is sort of a blame the victim. It has the elements of blame the victim in it, if this is the case. I'm not saying that you shouldn't eat, that you shouldn't exercise, those are super important, but it's not the whole story. So this is the Canadian Cancer Society data from last year. Overall, cancer is not increasing all that much in Canada, but if you look at the individual ones, tobacco-related cancers are going down. Fewer people are smoking in Canada. That's really good news. But the reason that cancer overall is not going down, in spite of that, is that these obesity-related cancers are going up. And generally, they are associated with hormonal functions, the breast cancer, the reproductive organs, and so on. And childhood onset inflammatory bowel disease. This is a horrible thing. These poor kitties, they can't eat, they're in incredible pain. And it's generally considered to be sort of a lifetime condition. It's not something that is like a cold, it doesn't go away in the future. It's been going up every province in Canada where they've got the data to examine it. The black in the middle is the average for the country. 4.6% annually from 1999 to 2010 in all the youth under 16 years of age, but it's being driven by the dramatic increases in the very young. So this is getting worse. 7% every single year.
Quebec dropped, maybe that's when they had their herbicide law.
It's possible. Yeah, it's possible. We don't really know.
And you're going to talk about glyphosate
And
registration.
so this is I can mention this right now, or we can mention it later. Prevent Cancer Now, along with some major environmental groups in Canada, has submitted an objection to the re-registration of glyphosate. Just a second. And one of the main reasons is that one person went into the reading room where you were able to examine the confidential test data, and the way we will get to how this all works, but basically they regulate pesticides on the basis of what's considered an adverse effect, and at very low doses there was a lot of anal staining, which is an indication of diarrhea in these animals, but that was not considered adverse. So these indications of exactly this type of problem were considered not to be adverse, and so the exposure that's permitted to glyphosate is much higher than it would have been if this kind of condition, this anal staining, had been considered to be adverse. That's just one example of what happens sort of behind the doors and behind the smoke screen of pesticide assessment. Yes?
And on that particular thing, who, on what basis, and who made the decision on that to discount what you were talking about?
That's Health Canada within Pest Management Regulatory Agency.
Oh, that was our own.
That's our own, yes. Now there is, certain efforts to be in conjunction with the states to be consistent, harmonized, and so on. And they do. This data is submitted by the pesticide manufacturers. I can't do this without talking about children. It's pretty standard. You probably have already heard all this, but children are very different. They are not little adults, as they say. They're particularly vulnerable in the earliest stages of development, sometimes before the mother even knows that she's pregnant. There's children with fetal alcohol syndrome who were affected before the mother had completely missed a period. And you know that they eat more proportionally. They eat more, they drink more, they breathe more. They are down in the dust levels, so they can breathe all the dust from the floor. If pesticide residues are in the carpet, they put their hands in their mouths, they put their toys in their mouths, they eat dirt, they do lots of wonderful things because they're kids and they're exploring. But in children, a lovely study that was done several years ago now, back in 2001, it was published, found that when herbicides were sprayed in a neighborhood, that children's largest dose of herbicides could come from their house dust. And that can happen even when that particular household does not spray the pesticides. So they're tracked in the dust, pets bring them in, that kind of thing. So you can't protect yourself from your neighbor's pesticides. And one very common thing that's said by the pesticide companies is, oh, we need to spray the dandelions on the turf because otherwise the children will slip and hurt themselves. I've heard that so many times. I went to the doctors I work with at the CHIO emergency room, and I said, so how often do you have people coming in and saying, I've got this broken arm because I slipped on a dandelion? They looked at me as if I had two heads and said, no, we don't have that. Children run into one another, and then that happens. But I said, if you're really interested in sports injuries, then try to get those kids to stop hitting the soccer ball. That was their concern. They had no concerns about dandelions. They were concerned about the pesticides, and they were very concerned about heading of the soccer ball. Yes, back.
Dr. Genu is here in Edmonton. He's at the Mill Creek Environmental Clinic. He asks all his patients to stop golfing because he said there's so much poison on the golf greens because they're spraying constantly. So yeah,
it's true. And in Ontario, I mentioned the pesticide law in Ontario. The golf courses avoided being included under that because they said we're going to reduce our pesticide use by using IPM. It was very difficult to extract the data because it was so awkward when we housed. But we did extract that data, and we'll be putting out a report probably next month showing that despite all of their promises and how they had seen the light regarding the toxicities of pesticides, in fact, despite all their promises, the pesticide use did not go down on golf courses in Ontario during the, in the last 10 years since all of the publicity and so on went on, it's not changed a thing. So, yes, Dr. Genuis is absolutely right, and if people are claiming that they've seen the light and they will use IPM to solve it, don't believe them. It hasn't happened. Actually, just while we're on the topic, IPM is a really interesting thing. It's short
that
for,
is.
yeah, I was just going to say, it's short for Integrated Pest Management. And the idea is that you use all sorts of other mechanisms and strategies to reduce pests before you actually resort to pesticides. Now, when IPM was actually started to be, come into existence, very early on, it bifurcated because the people who were really trying hard on IPM, they realized, well, we don't need these toxic chemicals, we can do without them. And they developed organic agriculture. And there were other people who were quite adamant that pesticides had to remain in their toolbox. And those are the people who are now practicing and advocating for IPM. But early IPM practitioners and the people who were developing actually went to organic means. It was one of those, the path through the woods kind of moments in history. So there, in Ontario, the doctors became very involved with this issue. What happened? It was basically instigated by the pesticide company because doctors, just as Dr. Genuis, were saying, well, this is a really serious issue. These are affecting kids, and so you should be using non-toxic things around your house, advocating for them in your parks, around your schools, in your neighborhoods, and in your cities, etc. And so the pesticide companies thought, well, Ontario College of Family Physicians is kind of a powerful voice, and so they challenged them on it. I said, well, what's the evidence? Pesticides are just fine. You can't prove that pesticides are hurting anything more than a fly that doesn't kill. And so the OCFP physicians, they took out the challenge and they used the best methodology to do a systematic review. And sure enough, they published their first review in 2004, and they found that 11 out of 11 cancer studies were positive. And they, both of the studies looking at effects of pesticides on the nervous system, they showed that there were definite effects. Reproductive effects, 42 out of the 50 studies that they examined showed that there were effects on impairing reproduction. And so this is actually rather difficult research to conduct because you can't just conduct a randomized controlled trial in people because it's unethical to expose them to pesticides. But these were the human studies that support what we see is happening in animal studies that are also in the literature. So by the time you look at the animal studies and then you see what's actually happening to people, you say, yes, there's definitely a very strong signal here, and these chemicals have no business where children are living and playing. Kathleen Cooper and others at the Environmental Law Association, along with the OCFP and other groups, published early exposures to hazardous chemicals and pollution, an association with chronic disease, a scoping review, and we could spend all afternoon talking about that. It's a fantastic report. It's available on the internet. I'd recommend you find that and look at it. It went well beyond just pesticides. The most recent report was an update by the OCFP looking at reproductive health outcomes, where most of the studies, again, showed significant effects. The neurodevelopmental and behavioral health outcomes were still consistent, and they also looked at respiratory health outcomes, where 9 out of 9, mostly insecticides, again, showed that asthma and so on were exacerbated by pesticide exposures. And they gave recommendations to family physicians to ask about this, to advocate. And so now in Ontario, we have one of America's best law for pesticides within urban areas. It's something that we want to spread. So as I said, in Canada, the feds determine whether or not a pesticide, as it's used according to the label, will pose an acceptable risk. And then the province licenses them. But the difference at a lower level of government is that Ontario and Halifax have a white list saying that these are the only chemicals that you can permit, or that are permitted to be used by homeowners, etc. And this not only is a straightforward means to legislate, it means that you're not continually playing this whack-a-mole because the pesticide companies are continuously producing some new product that has never been seen before. And it's, you know, there's only very limited evidence of any possible effects. And so you're not continually trying to catch up with the latest toxic chemicals. Yes, Rebecca?
Do you know offhand how those white lists are updated? Is it usually medical officers of health, or how is that kept up to date?
In Halifax, they have a public, actually, first of all, I don't think they're being updated all that frequently. Halifax has a group that will examine any potential addition, and Halifax is a much shorter list than Ontario's. Halifax, for instance, does not permit this iron chelate that is being proposed to be used in Edmonton.
Yeah, okay, so we should, if we want best practices, we probably look at Halifax.
Halifax has the best list. Yeah.
And Quebec.
Well, Quebec does not have a white list. Quebec bans a certain number of chemicals. Quebec was very instrumental in getting this whole ball rolling. There were some wonderful individuals. There was Dr. Jean Irwin, who was the physician who led Chelsea to ban certain chemicals from their lawns, and they were sued. This tiny little community was sued by the big ag companies. They were supported, and CELA, Canadian Environmental Law Association, and Eco Justice supported their trip all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada said that lower levels of government have the right to protect their citizens as their citizens feel that they should be protected. The Supreme Court of Canada did not even look at the science. They weren't dragged down that rabbit hole trying to decide whether the PMRA was the end all of science. It was what the citizens wanted. That was the basis of that decision. Mm-hmm. So we have alluded to the ethics of pesticides. You know, how do we determine that pesticides are hurting people? Because we can't do a randomized controlled trial like we could a drug. But in fact, offline we can go into a little bit longer steps story about this. But the PMRA hasn't considered human ingestion of 2,4-D within its assessment, and this was it's in a public peer-reviewed paper that was provided by the pesticide companies to the PMRA and also to the head of the research at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario Research Institute. So I had a good source when I said that to the Senate, and then the pesticide companies objected, and the Senate intervened, and it was a long story. But although there are ethical constraints and so on, when you get down into the nitty-gritty of it, then sometimes there's some pretty muddy stuff. We've seen examples where the industry was pushed to provide more data, and they came up with some data that was pretty old. It was not something that they just came up with. And they do not use what's considered best practices in terms of scientific review. I've worked in scientific review for drug interventions. And there's actually a science of how to do this review, and it's not being done by Health Canada. So, this testing, it's based on animal testing, it's confidential, it's conflicted, and it's just one ingredient at a time. Yes, Don?
Who decided what tests to do? Was it the industry initially?
It's hard to tell because this originally came from Agriculture Canada, and it's, I expect it was probably some kind of consultative initiative, because they would say, oh, well, we can do this much, but, there's limitations to how big the sample sizes can be. They're typically 8 animals per group, incredibly small sample sizes. So the odds, you have to have a very strong effect if you're going to see any effect whatsoever.
Wait a minute,
With
you're
sample sizes of
telling
8.
me some of these experiments are based on 8 animals?
Per group. Yeah, they have a control group, like a 0 exposure, a low, medium, and high exposure.
Whoa.
So we're looking at just over 30 animals per study.
And you wouldn't be able to know that unless you went to the reading room.
Exactly.
Criminy.
Yeah, I've been to the reading room. That's another whole story. We'll have to take that
I
on.
think that'd be a fun one to tell us, but
Is there a list that says, from PMRA or CNP, that if I am a company that wants to register a chemical, that I have to do these tests, that I have to provide information on these specific aspects of toxicity?
That's a really good question. It's not made public.
What's the secrecy?
Because I've asked
There's a
that
huge
many
amount.
times at CNP and PMRA, you don't get anywhere.
I know you don't. I've asked the same question. That's, amongst my mountain of emails unanswered by the PMRA.
that's so criminal.
What exactly are these requirements? And yet, we had imidacloprid registered temporarily for over 20 years because it was lacking some essential data. So it was temporarily registered, and now it's permanently registered. Atrazine, on the 30th of March last year, it was deregistered, and then it was subjected to, again, the same day, to another review, which bought them another whole year of registration for atrazine. Atrazine is a chemical that castrates male frogs, and it permits them to grow eggs in their testes. So frogs that, regular male tadpoles can mate and produce live offspring with male tadpoles that were raised in typical ditch water containing atrazine. And this is a very strong endocrine disruptor. It's put on a lot of corn in Canada. This is the kind of thing that's happening with our pesticides. There's very strong evidence that some of these, atrazine is not something that's used in lawns and gardens, but it is a very strong endocrine disruptor.
A really important point to make is that there was a study in Calgary done where they looked at pesticides in the spring that were applied on lawns in the fall, the previous fall. They found 2,4-D in the air, and they found dicamba, which is also in lawn chemical, exceeding provincial standards in the soil, and they found atrazine in the air, and they believed that it must have drifted from farms from outside of the city, all the way into town. So it's amazing how far and how persistent these pesticides are, way more than we're given years. I just wanted to bring that up because it was atrazine they found.
Yeah,
I was talking to the scientists.
there's been studies out of Alberta showing the phenoxy herbicides and atrazine in rainwater and so on. So when they're applied in one place, they don't stay there. It's not just the dog dragging the dust in from outside, it's coming from outside the city. In Ontario, they looked at Toronto and Ottawa. They looked at pesticide levels. This is before the ban on them. They looked at pesticide levels upstream and downstream of the cities, and the typical lawn chemicals they actually increased in concentration in the rivers going as they went from upstream to downstream of the cities. Yes.
What is the track record? I think it's a very bad one, of people asking about, there's the whole business of corporate confidentiality with regard to information, and especially with regard to their testing. Has any headway been made at all in getting, the information on the tests that yield poor or questionable results among those that they publish giving good results?
The only headway that was made the last time they reviewed the Pest Control Products Act, which was about 17 years ago, was that they introduced a reading room. So I actually helped kind of test drive this reading room, and I visited the reading room on several occasions to look at the data for 2,4-D. Now, this is very protective of anything that the chemical companies would not want you to see. So there is certain confidential business information that you're not allowed to examine, but you are allowed to examine the science. Into that room, well, first of all, you have to sign an affidavit. You swear an affidavit that you will not use all of this precious data to register your own pesticide. I assured them that they were quite safe on that. And then you're allowed to take in a pencil and paper. You're not allowed, nothing is provided in form of data sets or anything like that. If you're interested in some data, you take your pencil and paper in there and you just copy it all down after you find the information in literally hundreds of unsearchable PDFs. So it's just, we sort of theoretically have this access, but when push comes to shove, unless you've got a month of your life that you want to devote to finding within this, the needles within this big electronic haystack, it's not very helpful. But nevertheless, we did find that information about the anal staining.
So when you do find information in the library, you can tell somebody about it.
Yes, I tried to publish that in the CMAJ, and they would not publish it because it was not generally accessible. So you think, okay, I've gone to all this trouble. I have the report number. I have all this data, but then the idea is that a reviewer of your article would have to go to the reading room in order to see this data. So you can't have a peer-reviewed paper using this information. So there's, once again, you kind of hit a wall in terms of disseminating information about pesticides. Yes?
Is this because the chemical companies have a hold on the testing that goes on? And are they at the bottom of this lack of information?
Well, the information, most of the information that's actually considered is supplied by the chemical companies. When we provide epidemiological data, even studies that were conducted by Health Canada, the conclusion is that they're not helpful for pesticide registration because they don't fit in within their assessment paradigm. So, just keep hitting all of these road bumps when you're saying, but people are getting sicker, and this chemical can do this kind of thing. And it even says in Canadian data, it was Canadian data that contributed to the determination that glyphosate probably caused cancer. And yet it's not the conclusion of Health Canada. Go.
There was a recent paper looking at that specific question. They looked at all the articles published in about a 20-year period relating to environmental health and chemicals and pesticides, and in a very broad sense. And 2% of them related really to adverse effects, and looking at the effects of these specific chemicals on organisms. It was a remarkably small amount and very little money going to it. It was like, if you want to go into a life science PhD program, don't do that because it's a dead end. That was the impression one would get from reading that.
So you're missing a brilliant minds that could potentially find out these things because simply they know there's no career to
Well,
be
there
had.
would appear to be that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when you do analysis of the literature, if you're doing a systematic review, you look at what is called risk of bias, and one of the risks of bias is the funding. And when you look at particular issues, whether a particular chemical causes cancer, whether cell phones cause brain tumors, across the board on all of these, if the funding is from the companies, from the industry or whatever, yes, then you're much more likely to have a report that says there's no problem. And that's been reproduced umpteen times in various contexts, and it seems to be very consistent in that the piper pays. Piper pays and you play the tune.
Right.
So we need other
Or
sources.
sorry, he who pays the piper calls the tune. That's it.
See.
Yes.
The World Health Organization are the international agency on research in cancer. That should be a third-party, independent kind of opinion. How reliable do you think they are?
IARC has been pretty strong. They have been attacked viciously on the issue of glyphosate. And one of the concerns with IARC is that, it's not my concern, but IARC relies upon the public peer-reviewed literature, whereas all the pesticide regulators largely rely on this industry-funded, industry-supplied data. So you have two groups looking at different sorts of data and coming to opposite conclusions. Well, maybe you shouldn't be too surprised at that, but I would put my money with IARC before I would put it with them. So the phenoxy herbicides, it's the 2,4-D methylprop dicamba is very similar to the phenoxy herbicide. They're old. They were 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T made up Agent Orange. They're used on broadleaf plants, so they're used on grass because they don't kill the grass, but they do kill what we consider weeds, or some people consider weeds. They're usually mixed with other herbicides and ingredients that improve the spreading, that improve the penetration. If something improves the spreading and the penetration on the plant, it does the same thing on your skin. They've been registered since the 1960s on lawns, and literally tons of this can be used. One bit of progress that we made in Canada was that weed and feed products, after considerable lobbying, including by the Canadian Pediatric Society, these weed and feed products were banned in Canada because they're incompatible uses. You're supposed to just put the pesticide on the weeds, and you're supposed to spread the fertilizer everywhere else, or sort of more generally. And so those products actually were banned. The same reasoning was actually, just to kind of show you the reasoning. The same reasoning was applied to banning combination products of insect repellent and sunscreen, because insect repellent should be applied sparingly, not very frequently, and sunscreen should be applied more frequently. So that's good, So these combination products are no longer provided in Canada. They are available in the States. These phenoxy herbicides have been linked with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, leukemia, sarcoma, and IARC says that they're possibly carcinogenic to humans. They increase risks of bladder cancer in dogs, and interestingly, they're both estrogenic and androgenic. So when you have a chemical, it will not necessarily interact with only one type of these receptors. And immune surveillance immune suppression is noted as one of the contributory factors to increased prevalence of cancers. There's actually a genetic marker that was detected within a subset of people who had been exposed to 2,4-D and developed is non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and it's actually one of the less easily treated, according to my colleague who's a hematologist in Ottawa. And we see cancers and reproductive problems associated with 2,4-D and these other chemicals. It's not just the chemicals themselves, it's also the breakdown products and contaminants. These break down into chlorinated phenols, which are carcinogenic, and they're contaminated with dioxins. This was something else that the pesticide companies complained about me saying to the Senate. So dioxins are among the most toxic chemicals known to mankind. When they have 4 chlorines in particular positions, they're considered to be among the most toxic chemicals that are in the environment. And they're produced when you make Nazi herbicides because they're done in batch processes. It's cheaper and faster to do this at a higher temperature, just like it's faster to cook your soup on the stove at a higher temperature. And when you do that, the char, as it were, is dioxin. I spoke to Australian Broadcasting Corporation, told them about this. In the process of doing a special on 2,4-D, they grabbed one single product off the shelf, sent it off for testing, and what came back was just like the bad old days of the contamination of Agent Orange. He said that I put the PMRA in touch with the producer of the show. She sent the PMRA these results, and the PMRA's response to the fact that this is a systemic problem and how this pesticide is made is that, well, we don't need to worry, we don't have that brand in Canada. So I wasn't really very reassured. But pesticides do indeed look like hormones. This is the orange-brown color in the middle is the backbone of steroid hormones. And so you can see mecoprop, 2,4-D, and dioxins. And these do interfere with steroid hormones. Another example with another herbicide, these are the amine hormones for neurological function. And overlaid here is a chemical that is called aminopyrrolid. It's also used for weeds in Edmonton. And there have been some preliminary indications that this chemical does interfere with neurological function. There's concerns amongst some doctors around Ottawa, and that this may contribute to early problems from exposure in utero.
What was that called?
Aminopyrrolid. You spray that into Rosebud Park in the form of milestone. Aminopyrrolid for thistles, right?
Yeah, it's typically in a mixture with another chemical that is
Is that the one that
called
ends up in compost?
metsulfuron. Pardon?
Is that the one that ends up in the compost, pretty persistent?
Yes, it's very persistent, and if it's in your compost, it will kill your garden.
And clopyrrolid?
For years.
Clopyrrolid is similar.
It has been found in 99.9% of reservoirs in Alberta.
Wow.
So it is out there.
Yeah. I looked at these because this mixture called Clearview is used to spray parsnip in ditches. Parsnip is now considered a problem in Ottawa. I don't think that they have very many. Actually, there's a really tall one. Parsnip grows about this
Just
tall.
parsnip. Oh, sorry.
No, it's parsnip. It's regular parsnip that has gone. It's gone wild. It's gone poisonous. It walks at night and clacks.
Yeah,
I don't.
that's right.
But it's being public health has said that it's perfectly safe to. Although it's been found to contaminate groundwater, it's being sprayed in ditches and
It is
on
banned.
fractured bedrock.
It's banned in a couple of states because the animals that eat it, their manure will kill everything for years and years and years. So because people are worried about their gardens, they ban it in some states.
Well, that would be the trick.
Anyway, and the other half of this mixture is called metsulfuron, and it appears possibly to be interfering with the steroid hormones. So it seems like, the mixture from hell, but that's what's being sprayed in Ottawa ditches right now. well, not right now, but
But I thought Ottawa had an Ontario law. How is that?
this
law
is
doing?
considered, the law does not apply if the medical officer of health says that this is a health issue. And if you are exposed to the sap from parsnip, it's the same thing as limes, celery will do the same thing. And so you get the sap on your skin, which is actually quite difficult because they're very tough plants. And you have your skin for a long time in the sun, then there's a chemical reaction, you get very bad blistering. It can be quite nasty. There's people who had no idea who whippersnipped vast quantities of parsnip in their, their halter top and their short shorts and ended up in hospital. But this is a failing of public education.
I mean, what's worse?
So, well, there's, in Lanark County, I love Lanark, they actually had teams of people who went and picked the parsnip out of the ditches because they thought that their risk of parsnip was nothing compared with the risk of these chemicals. But anyway, this is what the kinds of things that you might run across when you start looking at these mixtures, particularly when ingredients are only measured one, or only assessed one at a time. And then, of course, this has another adjuvant, which has its own toxic properties. Glyphosate, I don't want to spend too much time on glyphosate, we could talk all day on glyphosate. It was actually patented as an antibiotic, which is why we're concerned about its contribution to inflammatory bowel disease. And it also results in, as it is applied to the land, a lot of the bacteria in the land that would normally be breaking down plant residues get killed. So after a lot of application of glyphosate, you end up with a lot more fungal species. So you end up with a lot more toxins from these fungi. So you have things like fusarium in your wheat, which can be very, very toxic. And if there's very much fusarium at all in your wheat, then you can't sell it. It's good for bonfires. So now to make the wheat dry faster and reduce the amount of fusarium that's in there, they actually apply the glyphosate to dry it down as well as to clear the field at the beginning of the season. So right before it's harvested, before it's completely ripe, they apply glyphosate and then the grain dries and then it's harvested. So it's fairly recent application of glyphosate when this happens. And it's kind of a consequence of the original application because organic farmers will tell you that as they make the transition, fusarium in their grains goes down and down and down until it's non-existent, just as a result of the soil being repleted with with the essential microbes. And it's also chelator. So cadmium, which is in prairie soils, it's also in our phosphate fertilizer, can be chelated and mobilized. And just by coincidence, cadmium has been going up in conventionally, in quotes, grown grains in Canada. I've been trying to get more data on that. It seems to be a very difficult thing to get more data on. I'll have to do freedom of information on that, I think. Yes, at that?
The Mill Creek Environmental Clinic, they have us sit in saunas trying to sweat out some of these chemicals. Glyphosate you can sweat out. The cadmium, they're having a hard time getting it out of people. Like they just
Some people
cannot.
do use some chelation for cadmium, but
But it's very difficult to do.
it is
Hard on
yeah.
you. Yeah.
And it binds in the bone.
Yeah.
And so it's cadmium and lead, you end up with a pretty big body reservoir. Cadmium's also very hard on the kidneys, and it seems to stick pretty well in a lot of tissues. So it's not something that builds up overnight, and it's not something you get rid of overnight. So glyphosate has also been used in deforestation and in drug wars. And there's some interesting studies that came out of that. Just to give you a little bit of background, glyphosate is known to cause DNA damage. There's several different ways that you can detect that. One's the AIM test, or you can look at DNA strand breaks using what they call a COMET assay, or you can look under the microscope and see what they call micronuclei, so these little structures within the cells. And so And not all of these tests are created equal. So there was a study that was funded by the Colombian and US governments who were invested in the drug war. And they found that using micronuclei, which is not a very sensitive test, that exposure to glyphosate-containing herbicides within the Colombian population was very minor and transitory. But then in Ecuador, right next door, independent scientists using a different test found that there was dose-dependent DNA damage as a result of exposure to glyphosate-containing herbicides. And the dose was, according to how far the people lived from this strip where it was being applied right at the border. So it's, once again, we see different results using different tests. What does it all mean? Well, sometimes you have to look at where the money's going, and you have to know enough about these tests to say, well, this is actually considered a higher quality or a lower quality test. And most famously, glyphosate in the one animal feeding study did induce a lot of adverse effects, including quite horrible mammary tumors. And this has seen quite a bit of attention. So we'll move on to insecticides. I just figure you need some base on this. So these chemicals often affect the nervous system, not all of them. They can also affect the development of the insect. So sometimes chemicals are applied that will stop the development of an early stage so that it does not develop into an adult. There are also lots of very ingenious ways to trap insects and so on. So there, some of the malathion and some of the other, what are called organophosphates, have been found in the Bow River. But neonicotinoids, they have kind of moved in as safer, in quotes, substitutes. They're newer chemicals. And so they, but now, of course, we're recognizing that they aren't quite as safe as we were promised at the beginning. But there are safer products and strategies, such as pathogens and parasites that are specific to insects. So these newer insects, these neonics, are chlorinated nicotine-like chemicals that act on the same receptors in insects as nicotine would. And they act similarly in people, except that they are broken down more quickly in people. So they don't have that nicotine-related effect in people. But they've also been linked to thyroid lesions and early life effects on brain development. And we know that the breakdown products in mammals can be a lot more toxic than the parent compound. So these are very persistent and toxic. They have also been found to be counterproductive in that they repel the friendlier insects, or they kill them. And insecticide resistance to merit, which is one of the corporate products, has developed in just a couple of years. So this is really complicated. This is confidential business information, except that it was given to the City of Ottawa, so it's now public information. I got it from the City of Ottawa. So I didn't have to go to the reading room and draw this by hand and then reproduce it.
And I was just about to be impressed. No, just
with my fine graphic skills. So I don't have graphic skills, that's for sure. So at the top we see imidacloprid, and then we see all these other chemicals all the way down. And this is supposedly the environmental breakdown, except it ends at 6-chloronicotinic acid. Usually, like when I went to school, which was, back when the dinosaurs were, when you talked about environmental breakdown, you ended up with carbon dioxide and water and that kind of thing. You get it.
The end.
Yeah, but that's where it ends. So what's going on here?
What are the secrets of it?
Well, this is something that we're actually investigating with somebody who's in pharmacy at the University of Toronto. Because the 6-chloronicotinic acid, the first thing that it's going to do, if you know anything about chemistry, it's going to lose that carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is right here. That hydrogens is going to pop over onto the pyridine ring, and then you're going to have something called 2-chloropyridine, which has the properties of carcinogen. It's very mobile in the environment, and it's very persistent, which doesn't seem like the kind of thing that we want to be leaving behind when we're using insecticides. So it's actually quite a difficult chemical to analyze. It sort of falls in the cracks of various methodologies, but just to say that, you know, it's not, there's a lot of complexity in this. So this is a very famous report that was done by Elizabeth Gillette examining, how many people have seen this before? A few. Okay. Basically, she went to Mexico where they were doing industrial agriculture in the valley, and some people didn't want to have anything to do with that, so they moved up into the hillside away from the industrial agriculture. And in both places, they had the same level of education, they had this, you know, state education, same level of income. They basically ate the same food because the people, just because you grow industrial agriculture doesn't mean that you get to eat it. So these people were having this, these children had the same kinds of exposure, except that some were regularly exposed to these pesticides. And you see on the right that the children just were not able to draw a figure. They were uncoordinated, they couldn't stand on one foot, they couldn't hop, they couldn't throw and catch a ball. There were a lot of things that she did. So these, you know, living within this kind of environment was very bad for kids. Last weekend when I was in California, we heard reports from the Salinas Valley that things have not changed. Kids are being sprayed with their parents in these, it's mostly Latinos, in the fields today. Well, maybe not today, but in the summer, in the Salinas Valley in California. Okay, so, and then of course there's the pyrethrin and pyrethroid insecticides that are derived from chrysanthemums. There is some potential synergy because the OP, the organophosphates, and the neonics act at the synapse of the nerve, whereas these pyrethroids act along the axon of the nerve. So if both are impaired, then, you know, potentially there would be greater risk to the nervous system. I don't know of a strong study looking at this possible synergy. So, this organophosphate chlorpyrifos is very similar to malathion. It's more persistent. It's sprayed or applied in granules to kill mosquitoes and larvae, and it's used in Edmonton. Now, the International Agency for Research on Cancer looked at tetrachlorvinphos, parathion, malathion, diazinon, and glyphosate. These are all organophosphate pesticides. The glyphosate obviously is a herbicide and the rest are insecticides. And generally, when one in a group is considered to be carcinogenic, it's common that more have this effect. So, you know, the fact that malathion and diazinon were both considered to be probable carcinogens means that chlorpyrifos probably is in the same situation, except that it just wasn't part of the study. Now, this is an interesting report from the US EPA. I'm not sure it's still available with Mr. Trump in power, but this is the relative potency factor for the female brain, rat, it's done in rats, looking at how much a given dose of the insecticide inhibits the acetylcholinesterase enzyme. And that's the mechanism of toxicity. That's the major mechanism of toxicity. So right here, we have malathion. This is the least toxic. This is what's used, if anybody's going to spray organophosphates in the rest of the country, this is the chemical that will be used. This, about 700 times more potent, is chlorpyrifos. So clearly there are some safer options. And interestingly, I included this partly because I knew that our friends would be joining us, and I'm really glad that you're able to. Dursban is a brand name that contains chlorpyrifos. On the label it says, caution, repeated exposure to cholinesterase inhibitors, that's any organophosphate, may without warning cause prolonged susceptibility to very small doses of any cholinesterase inhibitor. I've not seen any better description of chemical sensitivities on the label of a product that is for sale in Canada, that is used in your city than that. So, multiple chemical sensitivity, it's a recognized diagnosis. The malathion spraying was reapproved by Health Canada, and it was approved or registered at a higher application rate because mosquitoes are resistant. And it was re-registered without reapplying the extrapolation factor that is needed to protect children. So that's the paradigm for that particular one that's used by most municipalities if they decide that they have to farm for adult mosquitoes. Malathion was highly contested in the US. Somebody lost his job over it. The senior toxicologists at the EPA, the panel of biologists both objected to the re-registration within the states. And Public Health Ontario says that if you experience these effects during or following adulticiding, killing of adult mosquitoes, then seek immediate attention. Immediate medical attention. They include nausea, dizziness, confusion, headaches, weakness, diarrhea, eye, skin, nose, or throat irritation, or breathing problems. So this is within the West Nile virus action plan. So there's loads of things you can do if they are going to fog for mosquitoes to reduce your exposure. I won't go through them all now. And so Edmonton, yes, it is indeed unique, but West Nile virus is noted as a reason. And in Ontario, if you're going to be spraying against West Nile virus, you need to have really good evidence that there's West Nile virus there. You have to have West Nile virus in mosquito populations. That's not measured here. You have to have West Nile virus in people before you can start responding with malathion. But I gather that's not done here. And they do routine larviciding, very targeted in some places in some municipalities in Ontario. So West Nile virus is really a bird disease. Oakville in 2002, when West Nile virus arrived in Ontario in full force, this is kind of a heat map of where the most West Nile virus cases were. The dark purple at the bottom is the richest area in the entire GTA. This predated the pesticide law in Ontario. Greater Toronto area, yes. This area is used by filmmakers because it's so luxurious, all these mansions. A biologist could find no undeformed amphibians in this area. They used so much pesticides. That just happened to be where that was a hotspot for North America for West Nile virus infections. If pesticides solved West Nile virus, then we're missing out somehow. At least the richest area in the GTA was.
So lots of pesticides despite your law. Oh no, 02.
It was in 2002. So it predated the law, and so there were a lot of pesticides used in that particular area, and that was where they had the worst West Nile virus. Because the immune system of the bird is suppressed. There's some research on chickens, specifically on this issue. So if you spray these insecticides, the birds cannot respond as well. You have higher viral titers in the birds, and it's the mosquitoes bite the bird, they get the virus, and then they bite the person and give them the virus. What protects people are low viral titers in the birds. So you want to do everything you can to have healthy birds. So we do, there's this theory, there's some research backing it, and then there's experience showing that where these birds were impaired for one reason or another, that this is hypothetical, but because nobody measured, we know that there were high levels in the crows, but we have not done experiments using West Nile virus and malathion in crows. There are bacterial larvicides which are pretty specific to mosquitoes and don't impair the dragonflies, for instance, that control mosquitoes. There's a very famous study that was done in Cicero Swamp where after 11 years of applying organophosphate to control mosquitoes, to protect against eastern equine encephalitis, that mosquito populations had actually shifted and that it didn't really do any good. There's been a larvicide survey showing that BTI in ditches, that's the only thing that's allowed in ditches in Ottawa or Ontario, is that the Culex tarsalus population decreased and the Culex restaurants kind of moved in to fill the gap. And so you can nurture mosquito predators. We can share these resources with you and recognize that for West Nile virus, this biodiversity, health are very important to respond to any potential vector-borne disease. I mean, we think that West Nile virus or Lyme disease and all of the co-infections, you know, there's a lot of other infections out there, and this is not the be-all and the end-all. So we can't respond to every single vector-borne disease by applying toxic chemicals. There have been regulatory lapses. We've talked about some of those. And so what we need to do is to really educate the public. And instead of saying this is sufficiently safe, we have to identify the least toxic, most effective strategies and just go straight to them. So we need to change our value system in terms of how we're going to make these choices. And that's why we call this about making choices for healthy landscapes. So there's, you know, the perfect lawn that if you look on the left, oh, okay, it's got timing. So we don't need to use pesticides, but in all of these slides, yeah. So you basically have to make sure you have the soil. That Edmonton should be doing soil tests before they add iron to the soil. There are lots of options. Grass does need water. If you have very rich soil, you don't need to water as frequently. If you have very low, if you cut it too short, you'll have very little roots and it will not be resilient. And but with very deep roots, you don't need to have as much water, and particularly along the edges, you can maintain grass if that's what you choose to do. But there are a lot of other options for ground cover that are much better than grass. So, question. Which is the worst invasive species in Canada?
Humans.
Could be.
What about
If we're talking about plants, what about bluegrass?
or quackgrass is pretty nasty.
Sorry?
Quackgrass?
Quackgrass?
For farmers, it's a horrible.
Yeah, for farmers it's horrible. In cities, I don't know, maybe make an argument for the grass that we're trying to grow. Anyway, that's, I just have to thank many organizations and thank you for the opportunity.